First, a warm welcome to all three of you, Adam, Maya, Itzel. Thank you so much for joining us. As I said, there's folks from all across the country who are part of our network in different ways, gathered for our annual meeting together under the theme of Still Speaking Truth to Power. And we've been starting a conversation today about democracy, where we are as a country, the work that we do as FCNL in partnership with many others like you all, and what we can be doing in the year ahead, months, weeks, years ahead, to continue to advance the world that we seek. And we had a first discussion conversation with Timothy Snyder, who you might know from his work on tyranny. And I just want to carry through three phrases that I gathered from the conversation with him as we start our conversation. And those were for us to be thinking about the humanity of our democracy, the dignity of Congress and what we do with that, and the virtue of courage. So those are just three phrases that spoke to me in the last conversation as we started what will be a wonderful conversation with you all. I want to introduce you all to our audience. First of all, Adam Russell Taylor, thank you so much for being here. Reverend Adam Russell Taylor is president of Sojourners and a leader in the interfaith community here in Washington. We work closely in a lot of coalitions, and I'm so grateful to Adam for the organizing that he's done, particularly this year with faith coalitions to speak truth to power to Congress and the administration. The weekly Witness Wednesday vigils that many of our folks know about were really powerful, and thank you, Adam, for that leadership and all that you do. Itzel Hernandez is an AFSC organizer for immigrant justice, a DACA recipient, and an alumni of FCNL's Advocacy Corps. Welcome back, Itzel. We're always so thrilled when you are with us. And in addition to all the work that she does on migration justice with AFSC, every year she brings a delegation to attend FCNL's spring lobbying weekend. And so that's been wonderful, engaging more young people into the work of advocating for change. So thank you for your courage, your leadership. Thank you for being here. And Maya Wiley, thank you so much for joining us in the midst of a lot of travel, I know. Maya is an accomplished civil rights attorney, professor, and activist, and currently serves as the CEO and president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, where you are doing, I know, a tremendous amount of work in the face of all that we are facing. And you continue to be, for many of us, a truly inspiring public voice for human rights, democracy, and justice during these challenging times. So thank you for calling us all to stand up and speak out with you, and for being with us here for this conversation. So I just want to dive in with a question, just maybe start with a round robin, a question for each of you, and welcome you to kind of take it in whatever direction you want to go with it. And maybe, Adam, I'll start with you and the role of the faith community, because that is something that, of course, for FCNL is very important. And we have been thinking a lot about what is the role of the faith community right now at this time of escalating authoritarianism. And I would love to hear from you how you see the moment that we're in, and how our faith leaders that you're working with and engaging with in Washington and around the country responding.
Thanks, Bridget. It is so good to be with you all, and just so grateful for the long-standing partnership between Sojourners and FCNL on lots of different causes and issues. Well, first, just a word about Sojourners. Many of you know who we are. You heard about the introduction, but just invite you to learn more about us at sojo.net. We have lots of great content on the intersection of faith and politics, and we have a kind of an advocacy arm called Sojo Action that also works a lot. And I am on a train, unfortunately, so you'll hear a little background noise. I really see the faith community as a game changer when it comes to strengthening and ultimately protecting our democracy. Also, we can transform it, because we have to recognize that our democracy has been broken in lots of ways. We have been on an ongoing journey of becoming a more perfect union, of expanding who is included in the we the people. And in many ways, the Black church in particular, but also other faith communities, have been one of the most powerful democratizing forces in our nation's history. Point blank. And at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge with humility and with some repentance that many faith communities and Christian voices in particular have also been one of the strongest forces to advance the authoritarian project. And we can certainly point to the kind of role that the religious right has played, and that movement is kind of morphed into what many of us describe as a Christian nationalist movement, a white Christian nationalist movement that has been one of the forces supercharging the MAGA movement and really helped to put President Trump back into office. One of the things that the faith community brings to the table, and I'm really going to borrow from the framework of the Horizons Project, which is an organization that has been working to combat authoritarianism around the world and increasingly now is focused on the United States, is they have been popularizing this program or this framework around the 3 Bs. And as a Baptist preacher, I love the alliteration. So we have a role to play in blocking the harms of this administration. We have a key role in bridging many of the divides that exist ideologically, racially, culturally, red, blue, etc. And we have a really key role to play in building the future that we want, which requires that we cast a bold vision for what we're trying to build together. And I would say that vision is aligned with what Dr. King described as the beloved community. And I wrote a book about that. But it's also aligned with this ongoing commitment to become a more just and inclusive multiracial democracy. The one thing I would just close with really quickly is that I think we are in a moment of consolidating authoritarianism in our nation. That is alarming. And yet there are still many people of faith that find themselves on the sidelines. They may not kind of feel that as acutely, or maybe they think this is going to blow over. And yet, if we don't tap into the strength and the courage that is inherent in our faith traditions to do some of that blocking, bridging, and building work, then we are not being faithful to our faith itself. And so I can describe more of that as we go along, but let me just stop there for the time being.
Great, thank you so much. And the train looks great behind you. The beauty of virtual backgrounds here. But thank you for dealing with this on the train. Really appreciate
All good.
You're coming through just fine. And I really appreciate both your lifting up of the role of leadership of the Black church historically and now, and also the challenge of white Christian nationalism. And I'm sure we'll get back to more of this and more of that block, bridge, build framework and what we can be doing about in all those areas as we go on. I'd love to turn Itzel to you now and ask you to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing, what you're seeing, the communities that you are working with. I can't imagine all the weight that you're carrying right now. I live in Washington, D.C., and of course, we have our safety squads in the neighborhoods doing ICE Watch, and communities here are trying to respond. But you're watching all this, and you're working on this very closely with communities that are directly impacted. And when we were talking in preparation, you talked about immigration being the Trojan horse, that our democracy is under real threat, and the testing ground for dismantling our civil rights and liberties. So I would just love for you to talk a little bit about your work and how you're seeing this time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I have such a deep love and appreciation for FCNL and the platform and the knowledge that it brought to me and how that's helped inform me as an advocate, and of course the opportunity to create new advocates right every year. I'll just say, just to kind of circle back to the conversation about why I think it's the Trojan horse to dismantle our democracy. It's actually, I think, kind of interesting. I went to school to study national security studies, which is basically like the study of the system itself, right? Like, what are these agencies? What do we consider national security threats? And what became increasingly obvious to me, both with the curriculum and then the focus of the degree, was that there were very little conversations, and it's incredibly troubling and I think incredibly reflective, right? As I tell you this story, I want you to think about what we're seeing now, and you'll see how it all makes sense. There's no real introduction to things like civil rights, political science, constitutional law, right? And as you think about the shaping of the people that make up the federal government, that make up these federal agencies, those lack of intersections and that void, I think, is really reflective right now, right? And what is being carried out. What I'm seeing in the community level is, of course, a deep sense of fear, of anxiety, and of literally failing to recognize the country that we are seeing in this moment, right? We deal with all types of community members with different immigration statuses. We have a large legal services team, and you kind of see from all angles the erosion, right? For legal practitioners, the erosion of the rule of law. For community members, a disregard for safety and their well-being. For a lot of young people, this different sense of not being able to belong in the only place that you've ever known as home. And so the work that we are doing really spans the gamut. It goes from taking a rapid response call, right, and deploying folks to be able to make them aware of activity, as well as cooperating with a lot of service providers. And so in the midst of all this darkness and like this fear, I also just want to highlight that there is an opportunity here for us to really highlight, right, and uplift that those inhuman levels of treatment, that lack of regard for the rule of law, that this disregard for the collective well-being. There is no one in Chicago, regardless of immigration status, that is witnessing what is happening and feels more safe in their neighborhood when people are walking around masked up with guns, right? And so it allows us to really understand what we've always known to be true, which is that your safety is tied to my safety. Your well-being is tied to my well-being. And the only way forward is for us to collectively liberate ourselves from systems that only exist to oppress us, to discriminate us, to dehumanize us, and to violate the sanctity of human life.
Thank you so much. That really resonates and speaks powerfully. And this idea of our collective liberation, I think, is something that we are learning anew in a way, and the importance of it, and experiencing also the power of solidarity, you know, and the way that communities are responding and standing up together. And I just want to appreciate what you said about the lack of education, like sort of we don't learn about our rights or about what to do or about sort of democratic participation and what should that look like and how do we enhance the just and inclusive democracy in our country. I have 2 teenage boys, and you know, this is an ongoing conversation in my household as well. So thank you so much. Maya, I would love to turn to you and the long-standing, you know, incredible work of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and all that you are doing. Here we are watching literally decades of struggle and progress on civil and human rights being tossed aside, undermined. You know, it's overwhelming every day to try to even absorb the magnitude of what's happening. And I wonder, you know, how is the Leadership Conference working right now in the midst of this chaos and working to sustain and protect and can continue to advance our rights?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Bridget. And it's so wonderful to be with the Friends Committee because it's such a place and space and group of people who've been working so hard for so long and in coalition with us, as has Adam. And so wonderful, Ms. Hernandez, to see and hear your work and your voice. Look, we're working hard. We're working overtime. It's one of the things I like to remind people, and I say this proudly as a Black woman. Yo, we do get tired. We do. There's no such thing as tirelessness. We just don't stop when we're tired. So I think, you know, the playbook, part of the playbook of authoritarianism, and I really like the framing both from Tim Snyder, but also from Adam and from Itzel is important, but its fundamental play is to come fast, hard, create chaos, and make you run in many directions all at once. And we saw this in the Project 2025 playbook, which made very clear we are a white Christian nationalist ideology underpinning a very detailed agenda to come for everything all at once and use the first 100 days to do it hard. And what we saw, as much as that playbook was given to us in advance, the speed and aggressiveness with which they came out on day one of this new regime. I do not call it administration. Administrations administer. Might not agree with how they're administering, but they are administering. This is not an administration because it is not administering. It is intentionally seeking to distract, divide, and destroy. Those are my 3 Ds, which are not as positive as the 3 Bs, but the 3 Bs are the alternative, right? They are. So I'd say we're doing everything in the 3 Bs that you heard Adam lay out. But I do want to zero in, because something that we have really determined after spending a lot of time trying to elevate and educate while we were blocking as a coalition and on so many things, right, is to start to recognize the big thing that we had to do fewer, bigger things. Because part of the playbook is to send us in so many different directions all the time, constantly. And rather than responding and reacting to everything, kind of figuring out where and how we must block. So we must block when they come at us with DOGE. Because DOGE wasn't just about efficiency of government. In fact, it had nothing to do with efficiency of government. Spent I was going to say a curse word ton of money. I'm trying to be better in front of people like Adam. But this regime has really upped my cursing game. But it fundamentally was about destroying and about taking data to use it to destroy federal jobs, but also to go after people. It's showing up already now in terms of data that is trying to identify who is undocumented and make them less safe. It is also being used to try to interfere with our elections and use it to purge voter registration polls. I mean, voter registrations, and therefore voters, and block folks' access to the polls, and violate privacy rights. Use that data in all kinds of ways that can help people be targeted by a government that's weaponized against the people. We got to spend a lot of time on that as a form of blocking. But also, we've got to look for where and how we have proactive fights. So we have said this. We are going to, 1, fight for free and fair elections. That is job 1 over the next year, because everything else relies on it, which is why they have utilized an attack on immigrants. One of the main wedges to steal elections is mass deportation, and the way it feeds the big lie about whether or not we have election integrity. And by the way, you can use those same ICE agents and those same National Guard agents to suppress voters. And they will. So we have to be very, very, very front forward. And also, we don't get voting rights back, which they've also been stealing from us, unless we're showing up and ensuring that people can show up and use their voice and vote. And I would say after last Tuesday's elections, which saw record enthusiasm for our voters to show up and turn out, and where we didn't see the full election interference machine in operation yet, we did not see that in full force and effect yet. We've got to be prepared to block them in order to get our power back and ensure that we have power. So that's a big, huge focal point. But the other is like civil rights. We're always going to protect civil rights. And obviously voting rights is a key and fundamental civil right that they've been working. And by the way, they've been coming for our civil rights. This didn't start with Trump. The reason Project 2025 could be a whole document with 100 groups putting together 900 pages is because they've been working on it for a while. And they've been coming for our rights for a while. But, looking for how we can bring a fight to them. We are haven't launched it yet. You'll be hearing about it. But, if we're not protecting immigrants from mass deportation, we are conceding and ceding both the humanity of democracy. We are ceding the dignity of Congress because they're violating laws that our Congress has passed. And C, we're demonstrating courage if we do what we must do to be united for those who are most vulnerable. But it's also because they're using it to come for all of us. And we have to understand that they start with the most vulnerable in society. And so people of color who are immigrants are the most, but they also don't just care about immigrants. They also going to come for all people of color. They're going to come for young people because they don't like the way they vote. They come for people with disabilities because they just don't like them. They come for anyone who's not white Christian. I mean, all of the things, right? So we're going to launch a Masks Off, Rights On campaign to bring a fight and to support all of the amazing things we're seeing happening in communities and with all of our partners to protect people who are immigrant, but also just bring the fight, like not be afraid to bring the fight and to say, and part of the reason for talking about masking is because we are finding that across the political spectrum, people are thinking, even if they like the idea of deportations, they are uncomfortable with how it's happening. And it's important for us to leverage it because they're uncomfortable because it's rights violating. It's humanity's dignity violating, and they can see it and feel it. And we have to continue to dig into that to do that bridging of divides that Adam talked about. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. This is so helpful. And I think drawing the connections of how all of this it's intentional and each piece of it fits together, right? I want to ask about Congress. Congress was mentioned. We talked about, yes, like elections 2026. I think there's been a sense to some extent that we could replay Trump 1 administration, right? We could get to the midterms and then, we could flip something in Congress that would, create a different dynamic and be able to hold some people accountable. And I think a lot of people now are saying, we don't even know if we're going to get to midterms. And if we do, will they be free and fair? And what will Congress's role be? We're seeing war powers authorization, areas that FCNL works on, both appropriations, power of the purse, war powers. Congress has not been exerting really fundamental constitutional authorities that are critical to our democracy. So and to holding people accountable at some point. So I would love to hear more about sort of Congress, because FCNL, really tries to focus on Congress and what we can be doing with Congress now that it's reopening between now, and say the midterms as a nonpartisan, faith-based Quaker group. So anybody who wants to jump in, please.
I'm happy to jump in. So one, just grateful to be with both Maya and Itzel in this conversation. So we're, as a nation, about to celebrate our 250th birthday, the quincentennial. And one of the things that I think was brilliant about the design of our system of government was the separation of powers and checks and balances. And both of those are in heavy jeopardy right now, in part because, as you alluded to, Bridget, Congress has ceded the Republican-controlled Congress, and we're nonpartisan too, but it's important to note that the current Congress, House and Senate, are controlled by Republicans, have ceded a great deal of their power to the current regime, the current administration, and that is not only harmful to our democracy, it is also harmful to people. And so we have seen this play out in the context of the power of the purse, with the freezing of agencies, the dismantling of agencies like USAID, but also others. The Education Department has been practically dismantled. We've seen this with the freezing of funding and then the impoundment of funding and now rescissions. And so one of the reasons why Sojourners, in concert with FCNL and so many other faith partners, decided to do these weekly vigils during the first 100 days is I was filled with just righteous indignation that Congress was ceding so much of its power, and that that's a transpartisan issue. It's not about one individual policy decision. That is literally about the health and integrity of our government system itself. And so I think we have to be really, really clear and courageous about that. I also think that there was at least, some hopeful sign that during the government shutdown, one of kind of President Trump's desperation moves was to try to convince Republicans in the Senate to get rid of the filibuster so that he could then impose his will and end the shutdown. And there are enough Republicans that refuse to relinquish that. And we have had lots of conversations, as I'm sure you have, Bridget, with Republican offices who are deeply unnerved by much of the overreach and abuse of power of this current regime. Most of them don't feel courageous enough yet to speak about that publicly, but that's where our ongoing pressure is so critical. And I think that we can kind of buck up their courage in part by reminding them of the courage of their convictions that are tied to their faith. One of the scriptures that I've been turning to, actually two of them. One is Isaiah. It says, "Woe to you that call evil good and good evil." Sadly, we are seeing a lot of evil being pretended to be good. But the other one is the words of Jesus, who said, "What is a profit to gain the whole world, but then forfeit your own soul?" And part of what makes authoritarianism a form of evil, an evil system, is that it concentrates power in the hand of one person, in this case, the president, and that it then becomes a form of idolatry. And again, I think we have to tap into some of the language of our faith as we describe the dangers of this kind of competitive authoritarian system that we are now seeing consolidate before our eyes. So I'm hopeful about some of the things that are happening. These vigils were one example of that. I think, some of the advocacy we did together around the big bill also wasn't ultimately successful in opposing or preventing the cuts to SNAP and to Medicaid, but we were able to generate a lot of moral concern around that bill. And then, of course, in the shutdown, you couldn't find a more stark moral contrast between, a wrecking ball going to the east wing of the White House and these decadent, outrageous parties being held at Mar-a-Lago, with the administration then literally trying to prevent the courts to block SNAP benefits to many of the most vulnerable communities in our country. So I think, that kind of moral contrast is one that we need to expose and also be able to advocate with.
Thank you. Thank you.
I can
Itzel.
share. Yes, I think this is actually one of the reasons why immigration is one of my favorite things to lobby on, because there's plenty to go around. We did not get to this place without both parties agreeing that our immigrant neighbors and their families were disposable, right? We did not get here without parties buying into and not opposing actively, right, affirmatively, the narrative that these were communities that we did not need in our larger society. I just want to put one set of data in mind for folks as we're talking about the totality of the problem. Like, what is the conversation? We're having a conversation about what we do for the people that stay. And there are also conversations to be had about what we're going to do once people have left, right? United We Dream recently published a statistic that said that there's about 1.2 million immigrant workers that have left the country. If that stat is true, we need to understand why we have been sold a bag of goods and thinking that immigration is an isolated issue. Immigration is, as everything else, intrinsically part of the fabric of this country. So what that means is that 3 to 4% of our inflation from the last time I checked a couple months ago in an article by an economist is attributed to the lack of immigrant labor in the country, right? Immigrants actually create businesses at a higher rate than native borns. And so when people think about anti-immigrant policies, they are literally doing it to their own demise by creating this deportation machine. Not only are we spending money that we can be investing in communities, right? But we're also creating a system that then further creates ramifications for our totality of our well-being. And so all that to say that we have plenty of conversations to have on both sides of the aisle, right? We need to have conversations about why some Democratic lawmakers voted in favor of the Lincoln-Riley Act, which provides indefinite detention for people, right? And to me, one of the things that I think we really need to think about, besides just the lobbying aspect of it, as we think about what stories are we sharing, right, with our legislators to talk to them and get our point across, I also think that it serves as a great exercise for us to reflect on the concept of citizenship. Because in reality, what we have is an opportunity to reconsider and rethink and reimagine what we think of next time around when we think about immigration reform and a pathway to citizenship for people that have lived on average over 20 years in our country. Right. And I say that because the concept of citizenship is really what is being tested here, right? Does it mean anything to be a citizen? And sometimes I've always found it interesting when folks want to create these tiers of rights. If you have 9 digits to your name, then you have this other set of rights. If you don't have, and so to me, that's the reason why that's a dangerous game to play. We've seen all those things come to a halt now, right? Because now what we know is that for all intents and purposes, what the Supreme Court has done is allow for the blatant discrimination of people of color that look to be low wage. And I'll tell you that the 170 US citizens that have been detained and held don't feel like they're a citizen because they're not being treated. And of course, this is a historical pattern that we see in America, right? And that's another incredibly important part for us to really sit with this time around. We have seen atrocities carried out through our history, but there's always this urgency, and it's not, I think, necessarily with any malice, but this desire, because I do believe we have this collective hope that we can live up to the ideals that we have enshrined in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. I fundamentally believe that there's no one that inherently believes more in the idea of the American dream than people that are willing to risk their life to just have a shot at it, not even be guaranteed, but have an opportunity to reach it. But all that to say that I think we really have to think about when we share these stories to start talking about it in a different lens, to really start to understand that immigration has and always will be a human rights issue, right? And until we're willing and unapologetically doing conversations or having conversations in which we come to the aid of our neighbors, dehumanizing anyone else only dehumanizes us further. And I think that that's really what we have to think about. Yes, there are great economic arguments for immigration. Yes, there are a lot of amazing arguments for immigration. But I think if there's anything to take away when we talk to our legislators, is that we now hopefully have a better collective knowledge of what happens when one person is under threat or one group is under threat. As we've seen, cruelty has no bounds. It never stays. It's a poison. And I say that to people all the time. Hate, racism, and all the isms, they do not stop. That is inherently why they have to be abolished altogether. I've said this for many, many years ago before. I think it got a lot more acceptance widely, but any agency that is tasked with hunting down another human being is immoral and should never be a tool that we have in our belt, because who gets to be the prey just depends on the day. Right. And I think we really have to reflect when we talk to our legislators as to what kind of systems are we creating, not so much for others and to not think about them as for others, but for all of us collectively.
Well, I love these answers. So I'll just add 2 things. One, we are the majority of this country. We who believe in freedom, we who believe in democracy, we who believe in human dignity, we who believe in meeting people's needs and having a government that works for us. That is a majority of this country. We at the Leadership Conference are going to be putting out some data on this. We do an annual Civil Rights Monitor poll. It does 2 things. It gives us a sense of where people are, but because we do the poll year in, year out, we're in our 4th year, 75th year of existence, but 4th year of Civil Rights Monitor poll. But it also helps us see trends. Lines. But what it's part of why we started using as our tagline, we are the majority, because we got the data to prove it. And by the way, that's a nonpartisan statement. And and this is important for Congress, right? It is important how many people were motivated to show up last Tuesday. It is important to see how they showed up and what they were demanding by how they were using their voices. Any party can do that if they're speaking to what people need and want. There's a reason it came out the way it came out. And there's a reason we saw some places with and historic turnout of people who don't usually turn out. So one of the things we have to do to keep Congress doing what we need it to do, even if our allies, notwithstanding how many allies we have on the Hill, is reminding them of that. And that's one of the important things about being a coalition and being a diverse coalition and being a coalition that's willing to come together and say these are all connected and say this is all of us, even as we have different vantage points and different specific priorities, whether we're federal workers who are in unions, whether we're immigrants' rights groups, whether we're, legacy civil rights groups that are focused on Black community or Asian community or Latino community, whether we're people who are service providers doing healthcare. We've got all of that. People work on food justice. We've got all of that in the coalition. But we also, therefore, look like the country and exist across the country in terms of the constituencies represented. But I want to share a few data points because it really does matter. And it really also helps us do something we must do, which is use our collective voice to remind Congress they do have power, including the bully pulpit. So even if they can't pass legislation or stop legislation, and we saw it with the shutdown, right? We saw the influence of the power we bring from outside in to say, stand up, be strong. Doesn't always work out all the ways we hope, but it certainly makes a difference. And in this, I just want to say this because in this poll, we have seen a dramatic increase of a strong desire to show up at the polls, particularly for Black people. And I mean historic highs compared to what we've seen in previous polls. But also we've seen huge enthusiasm around what we call those who can be mobilized. So there's a category in the polling is who's most mobilizable, right? So if you think about the power we have now to really get people engaged, and not surprisingly, it's people who self-identify as liberal. It's older Black people. It's women. Now, that's not exclusive. I'm just saying if you can map out a demographic category and saying these people will get engaged with us on these issues. And while we hear all the time and we flatten in election cycles, economy, affordability. Yes, that's true. It's not because it's untrue. We know it's true. People are in pain. People have lost paychecks. People are watching and looking at their insurance premiums doubling. People are standing in food pantry lines despite having 2 jobs. ICE is now talking about attacking food pantry lines. I mean, but here's the point. In our data, it's clear. Economy is always number one. Well-being, that kind of economic well-being, it's always number one. So every election cycle is number one. Democracy and freedoms are number 2 by only a very small margin. I mean, they are neck and neck. People do not only vote for the economy, and they see the connection points between the two. So I only say that because it is our issues. It is the things that we are talking about that are highly motivating, but also give us the opportunity to mobilize more people with us when we give them something to do. And when we bring that to Congress, it gets our allies in Congress doing what we're telling them we need them to do. And that is powerful. It is powerful. And all you have to do is look at the difference between what Democrats did in March on the shutdown and what Democrats did this last cycle on the shutdown and how they did it.
Thank you so much. It is such a good reminder that we, the people who want freedom, are the majority, right? That we are powerful, and we're more powerful and building power as we work together more. It's a real encouragement for the work that we're doing with the FCNL and in coalition with all of you. So I want to turn to some questions from the audience. And please, folks, do feel free to keep adding questions into the Q&A box if you'd like. I want to actually start with a question that's a little bit of a carryover from a question that didn't get answered or asked fully in the last panel. Paula Van Dusen asks, if we could get Congress to pass 3 momentous laws at the beginning of 2027, say, so let's look forward and what's that big change that we want, the big vision of change, what would those 3 momentous laws be? 1, 2, or 3 of them? Maya's ready.
Voting rights, and then there's voting rights. And actually there are 3 bills. So, John Lewis Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, Freedom to Vote Act, and Native American Voting Rights Act. So that there is and I would add, okay, we always put DC statehood in there, by the way, but I say that because those are central to power of the majority, and the majority being able to exercise that power, and everything else will rise or fall on the ability for us to protect our power as a people, to have our voices heard, which means our votes counted and our ability to show up to the polls and not be blocked from them. So we at this leadership conference say that almost every cycle.
I can go next. Yes, after we secure our voting rights, I don't think it's a hot take, but like we really have to reconsider the creation of the Department of Homeland Security as a whole. Right, so much of what we're talking about, we must remember this is a post 9/11 world that we are living in. Right, the rights that people have lost, civil rights, surveillance that we're witnessing, the militarization comes as a result of one incredibly crucial thing, and that's the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Right, and so I think that's one. The second one, because it's been long enough, God knows, a pathway to citizenship for all people who are currently in the United States. And then the third thing, because I think it's one of the things that we don't need to actually grow it to the same size of the criminal system, which is basically the model that they have right now. The abolishment of prisons and of immigration detention centers. Again, I think that we really need to reconsider where all of that money goes. And I really hope that folks take into consideration the relativity of what we spend. We all know that we don't have a moral budget. I wish that we did. Dr. King spoke about it very often, but just for proportionality, farmers that are currently struggling right in this moment are getting like $10 billion moving for bailout. Once again, immigration has $170 billion that they've yet to see. And that's the other thing to really take into account here. We have not seen them fully funded with the amount of money that was allocated to them. And so what we do going forward and what we do after today in our respective communities really needs to center the fact that unfortunately, we haven't actually seen the worst of it, right? And we need to have conversations about what better things we could have used $170 billion in our country. And the answer is many things. But yeah, I think those are the three things that I would love to just knock out.
Just really quickly, +1, voting rights, #1, has to be a priority. And one of the campaigns that Sojourners has been leading with FCNL and many other faith-based organizations is called Face United to Save Democracy. And it is doing a lot of work in key states like Ohio and Florida and Arizona and so many more to ensure that the faith communities on the front lines are protecting the freedom to vote and ensuring that we can have a free, fair, and safe election, which is by no means guaranteed in the midterms, then of course in 2028. I'm deeply worried about some of the federal efforts to potentially sabotage this election, whether it's the voting machines or the imposition of federal troops or even potentially the use of violence, etc. So we have to be very vigilant about that. I also just +1 what Itzel just said about, real humane, sensible immigration legislation that leads to a path to citizenship, etc. And the third one I want to add into the equation, which isn't necessarily in a bill per se yet, but so much of the way that the president has been able to abuse his power is by abusing emergency powers through various bills. I won't go through all of them, but that's how he was able to impose his tariffs. That's how he's been able to deploy federal troops, etc. And so Congress needs to rein that in, and they can by reasserting their ability to prevent him from misusing emergency powers. There's different ways to do that. I won't get in all the weeds, but I think something along those lines is absolutely essential.
Great, thank you. You've given us our charge for lobbying for in the next months. I want to take another question that actually goes back to something that I think maybe Adam mentioned, but Gary Miller asks about the difference between framing our work as building versus saving in relation to democracy, and that it he's told, it says, I'm told that pretending that we still have a democracy is off-putting, particularly to young folks sometimes. How do you manage that struggle, that challenge of the fact that our democracy is very flawed and getting more flawed, and the framing of that for people? How have you seen that?
Question, and it's one of the reasons in my kind of opening remarks I talked a little bit about just how broken our democracy is, and that it's this ongoing project. I think I'm not at a point where I'm willing to let go of us being a democracy. I think we are kind of in a competitive authoritarian moment. In other words, we still have elections. They're not perfect, but they have been largely free elections, and we need to keep it that way. And we have to do the work to ensure we can make our democracy into a much more responsive, representative one. And so the language that I like to use is like short-term protect and strengthen so that we can be in a position to transform our democracy in the future. And that doesn't necessarily work for everyone, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Can I jump in on that one? Because one, I think it's an important question, and two, I really want to amen corner Adam's answer on competitive authoritarianism. There really is a difference between full-on dictatorship and and tyranny, and what we're seeing right now, which is a slide and could get there. Not saying it couldn't, but I actually, and it's not just true of young people. I mean, there are a lot of people in this country who have, histories of struggling to be seen and heard in this democracy. I think, one of the things that we have to start with is the power that we have now. I mean, it really is, we have power. We have power, and people are showing it every day. And so the way we are going to get what we want is by exercising it, even as they try to stop us. And so I just think it's really important to frame all our conversations around our power and not get into back and forth about how we categorize which stage of a decline into the realm, into the blackness, into the darkness we're in. Because what I have found is, it becomes an intellectual debate, and the majority of people trying to figure out, are they going to be able to get a job? Can they show up at school and not worry about their parents being kidnapped? Can they, make sure that they can pay the rent and not be evicted? Are they going to be able to put their kids through college? I mean, these are actually what's occupying people. And I think as a community very much focused and caring about democracy and knowing the majority cares about it too. But what they care about is what it's supposed to help them do. And what it's supposed to help them do is solve their problems. We haven't lost being able to use our power to get our government, our democracy, our system to do better at solving our problems. But if we're not participating, then we won't solve them. If we participate, and use our power, we have a real possibility of solving them. And I think that is the kind of way we want to stay out of the polemic with people who want to say it's already gone, is to point back to power and get people engaged.
Yeah, and I really like that, Maya, because I think that what I find, right, as somebody who is not a citizen, who cannot vote, but can do a lot of other things, I've always found that to be an interesting perspective for me to analyze what people collectively think as participating in their democracy, right? To me, participating in democracy goes beyond voting, as crucial as that is. It means engaging with my representatives. It means talking to my neighbors about the issues that they care about and hearing their concerns, hearing our disagreements. That is what democracy allows us to do. And like Adam said, I refuse to give up on it, right? We talk about the millions of people that vote, but there's more of millions of people that don't vote because they don't see themselves reflected in our current discourse. I'll also say that the other thing that I think about a lot is the fact that we need to be more transparent with young people, right? And everyone about the history of the country. I think that one of the things that young people have, and I think it goes back to like access to information and technology, and also being internationally connected to other movements of struggle, is that they are more aware, right? George Carlin has that famous quote of like, you know, it's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. To some degree, you have to have some level of buy-in into the propaganda, let's be real, that this was ever a really thriving democracy, right? We need to be, I think, a little bit more clear-eyed because the level of delusion that I think a lot of people might have worked themselves into in their ideologies and in these high fluency conversations is obviously not connecting to the realities of people on the ground, right? I think about why it is that it would be easy for somebody who lives in a rural community who has lost access to healthcare to think of someone like me or that looks like me to be the scapegoat to all their problems. And I don't find it in me to hate that person because it is a unfortunate, fairly logical, though incorrect, right, conclusion. And what I tell people when we talk about disagreements and points like that, or why is it that it's not seen in a negative lens, I always tell them that we have to understand that what people are telling us is that they are able to diagnose that there is something deeply wrong happening, right? There is something deeply wrong that they know themselves does not add up to live in the richest country in the world, but not have shelter, food, access to healthcare and education secured as a given human right. And so it's important for us as we engage in these conversations with people about our democracy to engage with all their concerns and really to have it as an invitation to talk about what does a reflective democracy, what does democracy feel like to you? Because maybe they've never felt like they've been part of the democratic process, right? And so having those conversations, I think really matters. And I'll say that on the, I don't know if it's like the silver lining, but it's forcing us to have a lot more conversations about our systems, about not taking things for granted. And that is something that, again, as somebody who is not a citizen, who's oftentimes lived on those marginalized otherness of it, makes me at least hopeful that people are able to understand why we can't take things for granted, right? We just simply can't. There were a lot of things that were working until they were not. And we have to be able to reflect on that as well and say, maybe we should talk about them unapologetically, why SNAP should exist and be fully funded, rather than compromise in the middle from the get-go.
Thank you all so much. I wish we had like an hour more, but I'm watching the clock and we've had a number of questions about the role of the churches, about the role of music and art and poetry. And it actually prompts me to ask one final question of each of you, because I am so grateful for your work, your leadership, your partnership with FCNL and our community. But what sustains you? You know, you are incredible leaders doing really hard work, carrying a very heavy weight. And I would, you know, love to hear what sustains you through this, and maybe you have some advice for us.
To say that in our office, which some of you can have a chance to visit at some point, we, in my favorite conference room, have a whole series of portraits on the wall. We call it our cloud of witnesses. It's out of Book of Hebrews. And I really do believe that there is this cloud that includes, you know, certainly the biblical prophets, but also includes modern day prophets like Dr. King and so many others. And they are cheering us on from the balcony of heaven. And so I just know of that rich legacy and the broad shoulders that we stand on. I think the other part for me is that, this is me speaking out of my Christian faith, I believe in a God that can make all things new and that can transform even the most hardened heart and mind. And so I think one of the things that is important for us is to bring the best of our faith to this work and this struggle. And some of that means that we have to do the hard work of loving our enemies and not giving up on anyone. And at the same time, we have to do the hard work of fighting tirelessly so that everyone's dignity can be protected.
You know, we have a similar to the leadership conference. We have all these past civil rights leaders from 75 years of history of the leadership conference around our office. So very similar to Adam's point, but actually, I often feel intimidated by that. And I often feel the pressure of feeling that I've been handed a baton and I can't drop it. I have all these photos of people who had been passing this baton, and I can't let it drop now. And so it's a little bit of a mixed bag for me, but as I leave here, I'm going to go to an awards ceremony. And it is a committee that I sit on that gives $20,000, which is a lot of money for the people I'm going to talk about, for community activists. And I mean community. I mean neighborhood. I mean people who have day jobs sometimes doing what they do. I mean people who are home health attendants, people who are artists, people who find a way where there has been no way to do something to improve people, lift them up, and improve their communities, and often in very activist ways, from criminal justice reform to immigration to economic development to culture and expression. And every single year, I will never not be on this committee as long as they will have me, because every time I feel like I'm not doing enough, or things are bad and hard, or I start to complain about how tired I am, and I go and we look at these applicants and we give these awards, and I think, we got this, and we don't got this alone. And what people are able to do and do on their own every single day that doesn't get in the newspapers, that is not in an influencer's, social media post, is happening everywhere all the time. And it is what will save us. And it just gives me so much hope and so much energy and so much renewal. And then I can go back to doing what I do.
What sustains me is people's own resilience and their willingness to defy the impossible odds. I think very deeply about a concept that is near and dear to my heart, and that's undocumented youth. You know, young folks that come to a time in their lives, oftentimes when they're in high school, about to apply to college or gonna get a driver's license. That's like one of the very statistical more likely times that you would engage about, social security numbers and in legal status. And I think about the fact that in the middle of all this work, right, like after I take a call about somebody who's been detained and dealing through that conversation with the family, after I do presentations about know your rights for like the billionth time in a month, after we strategize as to how we're going to try to create safety nets around people, somewhere in the middle of that chaos, and that's the thing I'm most grateful for, it's still a call from a young person about how they can still go to college. And that I think about many times over. Just like Maya said, when you think about like there's no more to give, I think to myself that these are not young people that are unaware of what's happening around them. They are deeply aware, more so than most people, right? They carry that and they don't get to step out of that. That is their existence. That is their being challenged and rejected in this moment of time. And I think about the courage of the human spirit to still dream. And that I think is the one thing that we must all reclaim in this moment. You do not give up your dignity unless you willingly surrender it. You do not give up your hopes and your dreams unless you want to give them up. And so what I tell a lot of the folks that organize in our office or volunteer is, as long as there are still kids in the middle of all this, dreaming that impossible dream. I'll give you some stats because I love them. There's approximately 1.3 million undocumented young people in the United States, and only 10% attempt to go to college, right? I didn't know those odds when I was doing it, and I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I didn't, because from that 10%, only 1 to 2% graduate. And I'm glad I didn't, because it would have felt and looked on paper unsurmountable. But if there's anything that I've learned in the time that I've organized, is that those stories of success are far more normal and daily, and they're happening every June and they're happening every May than we've realized. And so for me, what I tell young people is that organize with us, we have very young organizers in our office, and I always tell them, never forget that after all those really bad calls, there's still going to be someone dreaming, asking for somebody to help them. And it will be your privilege to hold both of those things at the same time. You can hold people's sorrows while you also hold someone's dream, and you can hold people's concerns while you also hold people's hope. And so in the middle of all that is the human experience. And in the middle of that, you have to be able to feed yourself to continue to say, good things are still happening because they are, right? As Maya said, great people are about to hear great news. And like those little things, you can live off of those because you'll find those daily. Someone's kindness, someone's smile, you will find it daily. And so I just encourage people to think about what fuels them. And the more common it is, the better off you'll be because you'll never let your soul starve for inspiration and hope and resilience.
Thank you so much. You have blessed us so much with your courage and your faith and your hope and your inspiration and your work and all that you do. And it is our privilege to work alongside and in coalition with you. I hope you know that we are here to pass those batons and keep dreaming and be in faith and solidarity in all the weeks and months and all the work to come. So we're so grateful. I know there's an audience out there getting all those hearts going and just feeling so inspired and encouraged by all that you've shared with us. So I just want to thank you so much for being with us, for all that you do. And yes, please know that you are in our hearts. And as we say, we are holding you and all of us in the light for the work ahead.